Hi all, I'm Arthur Whitecrummy, provincial affairs reporter with the Regina Leader Post, and I'm here doing a post-budget debrief with our political columnist, Murray Mandryk. How are you doing today, Murray?
Tired. Are you tired after yesterday?
I think I got 4 hours of sleep the night before.
Isn't that stupid?
12 hours of sleep tonight, so that was great.
You're going to make up for it today. No?
Well earned. We have a balanced budget.
Sort of.
In name, at least. $34.4 million of wiggle room. Did they come by it honestly?
Well, $34.4 million of wiggle room is no wiggle room. It's a blink of the eye in the course of a Saskatchewan budget. It's like Finance Minister Donna Harpower said, and she's not the first Saskatchewan finance minister to say it. Something like a crop failure, anything that's going on in terms of a bad forest fire year is going to change that quite dramatically. And by quite dramatically, we're talking to the tune of a few $100 million sometimes as many as $500 million I've seen in terms of increased costs. So there is legitimate reason to be concerned. There's real legitimate reason to be optimistic. If oil prices hit 60 bucks today and they continue to soar, that's beyond expectations. If potash isn't as bad as they think it's going to be and we get a little bit more money, we're seeing a lot more tax revenue, which really stabilizes things for government. There's a reason why governments want to be more dependent on taxes than they do on resource revenue, because it's a more stable source of money flowing in. So I can't honestly say that the $34.4 million surplus won't happen. What I can say is it's highly unlikely we'll see that number, and quite unlikely it wouldn't be completely surprising if it is a deficit budget by the end of the year. But if all things go according to plan, it should be pretty close. They weren't outrageous in a lot of their predictions like they were in other years. So that's always a good thing.
Do you think we're ever going to see the end to this PST hike? 1% increase brought into children's clothing back in 2017 and a number of other important expense items for Saskatchewan people. Like, are we ever going to see that go away?
Oh, of course we are. When some government's going to be desperate enough to use it to buy votes or whatever, PST goes down. And I wouldn't be terribly surprised if it's this government. And I'd be quite frank, if we had a really good year coming forward, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't sort of promised for the next fiscal year going into the budget to be nothing better than having a March budget next year and having 6 months of a lower PST before you go to the polls. So bet that they have that at least in mind in terms of something they want to do. Bet that they're also thinking one term ahead, and that if they're looking at an election in 2024, that's a hell of a time to basically be lowering the tax if you can't right now. I think what they would probably do instead, though, is probably go back to a broader or sort of more narrow base of the PST, meaning that there would be fewer things that are being taxed, like the restaurant meals, and what the NDP opposition have been talking about the PST on labor is one thing that they might very well do. You notice the theme of this budget was pretty much to cut the NDP off from most criticisms. That's been a really frequent one of government. So they might pick specific aspects of the PST, like the tax on labor, to use as something to lower within the next year, or maybe even do it at midterm. You can always make adjustments if you think you have a lot of money coming in.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right that a lot of the targeted spending that they did were in areas that the NDP has tried to hammer them on recently. The fact that they spent in education, in mental health, what does this do for the NDP and their room for maneuver going into the election?
Well, I think some of the education numbers that they threw out as government are where they might be a little bit actually more susceptible as government. There's no real there's no additional money for advanced education and no really great amount for K-12 education. I think eventually that's going to be recognized by people, by stakeholders and others that have vested interest in education, and that's going to be one area that's possibly big time problem for the Sask Party government. But I think you're right about everything else. They pretty much cut the NDP off, whether it was mental health or even something related to the intersection focus for highways as opposed to spending money on pavement, which is what governments always do when they get close to the election. Nothing better than having your voters run on smoother roads come closer to the campaign than not. But the better way to spend money in this particular case might be a few rumble strips, given what happened in Humboldt and given what needs are. So it was kind of smart spending, both politically and resource-wise, that particular way. The one that fascinates me is the potash tax, because that took everybody by surprise. No one was thinking that, after all these years, literally years, of the Sask Party government being resistant to a potash royalty review that the NDP were absolutely calling for, all of a sudden they find a niche within the very complicated royalty taxation of potash to say, you know what? The industry no longer needs this anymore, and it would be a good thing for us to tune of, I think, $117 million to dispense with this and have that money basically flowing into our coffers to do some of the things that they did in the budget they might not have otherwise thought they could do, and to frankly balance the budget using that extra $117 million. And sorry, go ahead.
Somehow the two biggest potash companies seem to have a different take on it.
Yeah, go figure.
They felt like they needed that money. Do you think by any chance the changes may have had anything to do with the dispute between the government and Nutrien about head office jobs?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The government will be, you'll ask them and they'll be saying absolutely had nothing to do with it, but then really it did. It will be one of those where of course they did. They don't particularly, they've had issues with Nutrien in terms of the head offices. They did this pretty much on their own. I don't have much sympathy for the potash companies, though, because they get a pretty good ride in Saskatchewan. Both they and the government know it's not even like the oil sector where the threats are made that if we don't have a favorable royalty structure in this province, they might pull up stakes and drill elsewhere. There's only so many places where you find that pink salt underneath the earth, and there's only so many places that you can drill down for it. And once you're in the position to do so, you've made one hell of a capital investment where you just can't move on. So both the jurisdiction and the companies have to find a way to get along. In my mind, traditionally through Saskatchewan, they've always found a way to get along that seems to be in the favor of the potash companies, which is fine, because they do provide jobs and do provide us with a good service. But for as much as you're going to hear from Nutrien right now, and maybe a few others, but particularly Nutrien, they aren't going to be suffering much from this. I think what the government did was highly fair and politically smart, because once again, it's kind of the thing that the NDP would do. And that we now have the NDP actually complaining about it kind of shows you how badly off their game they are, where instead they should have been saying, thanks for listening us, thanks for doing at least something. We probably need to do more, because that would have been traditionally the NDP position.
The NDP seems to have found fault above all with the size of the debt. We have a balanced budget. We don't have a deficit, but we do have a rising debt because of capital spending. Does that matter? Is it something that ordinary people should be concerned about?
Well, look, it's an important issue, and let's never underestimate how much it cost us. And one of the things the government, I thought, really got away with this particular budget is basically not taking ownership of the fact that the debt service charges went up, I think, another $60 million over last year, and that's in essence the credit card bill interest we pay for having run up debt in the past, and that's a big deal. It's a big deal that we're going to be hitting $26 billion by 2023 and almost $21 billion by the end of this fiscal year. So that's a lot of money. However, people kind of like the idea of seeing government build things and borrow money for the purposes of building things. They see that in their own lives, and they equate it to what they would do with their own mortgages. So it never is the issue that probably should be. And it's a tough issue for the NDP to criticize, because they have their own pretty aggressive spend agenda if they get into power. It's mostly on the operational side, but it's still big-time dollars. And if they need to better account for how they would balance a budget if they were ever in power, although that seems to be unlikely. It's sitting at 12, 13 seats right now. So.
Well, that's it from us. Thanks for tuning in. And for more information on the budget, feel free to go to leaderpost.com.
Thanks, Arthur.
Thanks, Murray.